Darius had fought countless battles in his years as a soldier, but none had felt as brutal as this one. The Phoenix village lay in ruins, smoke billowing from the remains of charred homes and broken lives. His sword was slick with the blood of enemies, and yet it wasn't enough. There was always more to fight, more to destroy. His orders had been clear: wipe out the Phoenix, every last one of them. There was no mercy in war, there never had been. He moved through the village with practiced ease, scanning for any survivors who might be hiding. The crackling of the burning wood in the distance was the only sound that accompanied the footfalls of his comrades. His armor, heavy and stained, weighed him down, but his mind was sharp. Every soldier knew the drill, and he was no different. Locate the enemy, eliminate them, and return to the camp. Simple, efficient. His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, moving swiftly through the wreckage, when something caught his attention. A small figure hunched over, struggling to stand. A Phoenix girl, barely more than a child. Her fur was singed, her body battered. Her golden eyes met his for a fleeting second, wide with fear. Darius stopped dead in his tracks, his grip tightening around the hilt of his sword. She was weak, on the edge of collapse, but the instinct to finish what he'd started burned in his chest. He should kill her, just as he had done to so many others. There was no place for mercy in this war, but something in her eyes, something raw and pleading, stopped him. He moved closer, slowly, his every step deliberate. The girl trembled, her ragged breathing quickening as she backed away, her legs barely holding her upright. But she was cornered, there was nowhere to run. Darius could see the terror in her face, the way she shook as if bracing for the inevitable strike. His sword gleamed in the sunlight, sharp and unforgiving. Yet he did nothing. His breath was heavy, a strange hesitation settling in his chest. The beast people had been enemies for years, but she wasn't a warrior. She was just a girl, weak, defenseless. She didn't deserve this. Not in the same way the others did. He cursed under his breath. "You should be dead," he muttered, more to himself than to her. His voice was harsh, but there was no anger in it, just exhaustion. This war had drained him of everything but duty, and yet, in that moment, he found himself questioning it. The girl fell to her knees, a soft whimper escaping her lips. Her once proud features were now twisted in pain, her golden fur matted with blood. She was close to death. Darius could feel the weight of his sword. He should strike, end it now, but instead, he dropped to one knee beside her, his armor scraping against the ground. His calloused hands, so used to killing, were suddenly unsure. He reached out, lifting her chin, his touch gentle, as if afraid to break her fragile form. Her wide, fearful eyes met his once more, and for the briefest moment, she wasn't a Phoenix, an enemy, or a monster. She was just a person. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, hoarse from pain. "Why don't you kill me?" The question hung in the air, and Darius could only stare at her. It was absurd. He had been trained to kill without question, to destroy without remorse. But now, in this moment, he felt something shift in him, something unfamiliar, something dangerous. "I don't know," he admitted quietly, his hand still resting on her cheek, as if it belonged there. He had never questioned his orders before, but now, looking at her, the certainty he'd always relied on felt suddenly hollow. Her breath was shallow, and she swayed slightly, her body struggling to remain upright. Darius knew she didn't have much time left. If he didn't act, she'd die on her own. The thought of letting her perish here, alone in the wreckage of her village, unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. "I won't kill you," he said firmly, surprising even himself with the conviction in his voice. "But I'm not letting you die here either." He stood, lifting her carefully into his arms, and began to carry her away from the destruction. He couldn't afford to stay here for long. The battle wasn't over, and there was still much to do. But there was something about this moment, about this girl, that kept him from following through with his original plan. The further he moved away from the heart of the destruction, the more he realized how little he understood about what was happening to him. He wasn't a fool. He knew that the feelings were beasts in the eyes of his people. He had been taught to hate them, to see them as nothing more than enemies to be eradicated. Yet here he was rescuing one. She was barely conscious, her small body limp in his arms. Darius quickened his pace, scanning the area for signs of enemy movement. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he needed to get as far from the battle as possible. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the ruined land, Darius finally spotted a cave in the distance. A small, isolated refuge. It was better than nothing. At least there, they would be hidden from view. He entered the cave, carefully lowering the girl to the ground. Her breathing was steady, but she was still unconscious, her small chest rising and falling with each labored breath. Darius stared down at her for a long moment, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had saved her. But for what? She was an enemy. He was a soldier, a warrior. This could cost him everything. His honor, his loyalty to his people, his mission. But as he watched her sleep, her fragile form curled in a small defensive ball, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. With a deep sigh, he settled against the cave wall, keeping his distance. He had no idea what to do next. But one thing was certain. The world had just shifted beneath his feet, and he had no idea how deep this change would go. In the dim light of the cave, as the wind howled outside, Darius tried to close his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. His thoughts were filled with the girl Lyra, her golden eyes, her soft fur, the way her scent lingered in the air. The uncertainty of the future pressed on him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the stirrings of something more than duty. The first rays of dawn crept into the cave, casting a soft, golden light over the space. Darius hadn't slept a wink. His eyes had remained fixed on the Felix girl, Lyra as she lay motionless on the cold ground. Her breathing had steadied during the night, and though she appeared still fragile, the tension in her face had eased slightly. It was a relief, but it did nothing to quell the storm in Darius's mind. His every instinct told him that he had made a mistake. He should have left her. His orders were clear: kill the enemy and move on. He wasn't a healer, he wasn't a caretaker. He was a soldier. And yet, here he was, with a creature from the enemy's side, resting on the ground in front of him as if nothing had changed. But something had changed deeply within him. Darius rose to his feet and made his way to the entrance of the cave, scanning the horizon. The battle was far behind them, but the danger wasn't over. His mind kept replaying that moment when he'd stopped, hesitating over whether to kill or to save. He didn't know why he had done it, what was so different about her, about this one feelings that made him break his own code. But whatever the reason, it wasn't something he could undo. He had no real plan for what came next. His orders had been clear: eliminate the feelings threat. And yet, here he was protecting one. The very idea made his stomach churn, but he didn't know what else to do. He couldn't just leave her to die, could he? As if on cue, Lyra stirred. Her body twitched slightly, her fur ruffling, and she let out a faint groan. Darius turned quickly, his instincts still on edge. His hand instinctively went to his sword, but then he stopped. She wasn't a threat, at least not right now. The more he observed her, the more he realized just how small and vulnerable she was. There was nothing in her demeanor that screamed danger. Slowly, she opened her golden eyes, blinking against the dim light of the cave. They were filled with confusion, fear, and something else. Something more vulnerable than he had anticipated. Her gaze locked onto his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, but neither of them broke it. Finally, she spoke, her voice weak and raspy. "Why are you helping me?" Lyra's voice was quiet, a tremor in each word. Darius stood still, his mind racing. He could have given any number of answers, explained that it was a mistake, that he had no choice, that it was the right thing to do. But none of those excuses felt right. Instead, he found himself saying, "I couldn't just leave you to die." Lyra blinked again, her expression flickering with uncertainty. Why? She whispered again, softer this time. You should have killed me. The question stung, but Darius didn't answer right away. What could he say? He wasn't sure why he hadn't killed her. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him, like she had seen something in him that he hadn't even known was there. Maybe it was because he had seen so much death already that he couldn't bring himself to add one more to the tally. I don't know, he muttered, his voice low, betraying a hint of confusion that he didn't want to admit even to himself. I just couldn't. For a moment, they just stared at each other. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a fragile bond that neither of them had asked for but which had begun to take root. Darius didn't know what to make of it, but he felt its weight. It pressed on him, tugging at his conscience in a way he hadn't experienced before. Lyra shifted weakly, trying to sit up. The movement was slow, her body still recovering from the injuries she had sustained during the battle. Darius immediately moved to her side, instinctively reaching out to steady her. Don't try to move too much, he warned gently, his voice softening. Lyra looked up at him, her expression filled with something that resembled gratitude, though it was mixed with uncertainty. Her golden eyes held his for a long moment, a quiet tension swirling between them. It wasn't just the proximity or the physical touch. It was something deeper, something that both unsettled and captivated him. Why are you helping me? Lyra asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a vulnerability in her words that struck him harder than any blow in battle. She wasn't just asking for his reasons. She was asking for something more. She wanted to understand why, despite everything, he was still here. Darius opened his mouth, but the words he had prepared died on his tongue. He wasn't sure why he was here, why he hadn't just left her behind or finished what he had started. All he knew was that as he looked at her, this fragile, wounded creature, something inside of him had shifted. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to keep her safe. I don't know, he said again, his voice raw with frustration. I don't know why, but I'm not going to hurt you. Lyra's eyes softened slightly, though the wariness remained. She was a Phoenix. Her people had been enemies to humans for years, and yet here they were, sharing a space, speaking with a kind of tentative understanding. She should have hated him, feared him, or even attacked him. But instead, she had stayed silent, accepting his help, even if only because she had no other choice. Her gaze dropped to the ground, and for a moment, the silence stretched between them once more. But then, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. Thank you, she said, the words simple but sincere. Darius nodded, unsure how to respond. Rest. You're not well yet. She nodded, sinking back into the makeshift bed he had created for her in the cave. The air between them felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension, but neither of them addressed it directly. Instead, Darius stood up and began to gather supplies from his pack, preparing a small meal. His movements were mechanical, but his mind was elsewhere. It was hard to focus on anything but the girl who had somehow become the center of his thoughts. As he turned back to her, he noticed that she was watching him, her golden eyes following every movement. There was something about the way she looked at him that made him feel exposed, like she could see right through him. He quickly turned away, trying to push aside the discomfort that had settled in his chest. But no matter how much he tried to focus on something else, the truth lingered. He had done something he could never undo, and now there was no turning back. Lyra's soft voice broke through his thoughts once more. What happens now? Darius didn't have an answer. All he knew was that, somehow, the war had taken a turn he hadn't expected, and he was standing on the edge of something far more complicated than any battle he had ever faced. As they sat in the quiet cave, the weight of their choices hanging between them, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer just enemies. Something had begun to change, and he wasn't sure how far it would go, or if he even wanted to find out. Darius woke with a start, the morning sun already casting long shadows across the cave's entrance. His eyes snapped open, and for a moment he didn't remember where he was. The familiar weight of his sword and armor were gone, replaced by the damp chill of the cave. He blinked, disoriented, before remembering why he had come here. why he was still here. Lyra. She was still asleep, her small body curled against the stone floor, her fur darkened by the remnants of the blood she'd lost the previous day. Her chest rose and fell slowly, but there was something more peaceful about her now. Her breathing was deeper, her face no longer contorted in pain. But it wasn't enough to make Darius feel at ease. It had been a day since he had found her, and still no answers had come. She had yet to speak much beyond the simple thank you she had murmured the night before, and he hadn't pressed her for more. His own thoughts were a mess, swirling in a way that he didn't understand. He had done his duty and saved her, something he had no business doing, but now what? What would he do with her? His eyes fell on the girl again, her golden eyes closed, her body twitching slightly as she stirred. Despite her obvious frailty, there was a strength about her, something deep inside her that had kept her alive through the battle, something he hadn't anticipated. He stood and began to pace, rubbing his temples. It was harder than he wanted to admit to shake the feeling that this, whatever was between them, was more than just an accident of war. He had saved her, and for reasons he couldn't comprehend, he didn't regret it. He wanted to protect her. The thought startled him. He wasn't supposed to want anything like that. His mission had always been clear: fight, kill, win. He had long ago stopped considering the consequences, but this felt different. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword, and he drew in a deep breath, trying to calm the chaotic thoughts swirling in his mind. He had to remember who he was, who she was. She was an enemy, a soldier of the Phoenix tribe, the very people he had fought and bled against for years. He turned back to the fire he had started the night before, his eyes lingering on the smoke rising in the cool air. There was a distant sound of something stirring, and he turned to find Lyra now awake, her golden eyes locking onto his. "Are you feeling better?" Darius asked quietly, trying to sound like his usual self, but there was something in his voice that betrayed his calm facade. Lyra nodded slowly, sitting up with some difficulty, her body clearly still in pain, but there was a fire in her eyes that spoke volumes: determination, resilience. It made Darius pause. "I'll be all right," she said softly, her voice still hoarse but stronger than before. "Thank you for saving me." Darius said nothing for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "It wasn't really a choice," he muttered, looking away. He couldn't tell her that part of him had wanted to save her. Asterisk needed asterisk to save her. It felt wrong to even think it, let alone say it aloud. "You don't have to keep thanking me," he added quickly, trying to change the subject. "I'll gather some supplies. We'll get you somewhere safe." Lyra looked at him, her golden eyes intense. "Safe?" she echoed, as though the word was foreign to her. "You're a soldier. I'm the enemy." Darius stiffened, the words stinging more than he had expected. She wasn't wrong. She was the enemy. And yet, the more he stared at her, the more he found it difficult to see her that way. "I didn't say I wasn't," he replied after a beat, his voice cold again, though it was strained. "But you're still alive, aren't you?" Her gaze softened, and for a moment, there was no hostility between them. Just two individuals who, despite the vast differences between them, were caught in a strange moment of understanding. The silence that followed felt almost intimate, charged in a way neither of them had expected. It made Darius shift uncomfortably. "I'll need to get back," she said after a long pause, breaking the silence. "I can't stay here forever." Darius frowned. "Your people will be looking for you." Lyra's face hardened at the mention of her tribe. "Yes," she replied, her voice colder now. "They'll come for me. If I don't return, they'll send someone to find me." She hesitated, then added, "But I don't think I can go back." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, and it wasn't lost on Darius how vulnerable that made her sound. This Phoenix warrior, this enemy, was human in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't just a savage beast, not just a monster to be eradicated. She was a person in pain, someone who had suffered and was now torn between her duty and the possibility of something else. Darius's mind raced. She couldn't go back. That much was clear. But where could she go? She couldn't stay here, not forever. If anyone from her tribe found her, they wouldn't hesitate to kill him, and she would probably be punished as well for betraying them. He rubbed his temples again, frustration bubbling inside him. You can't go back, he said, almost to himself. Lyra looked at him, the tension between them thickening once more. I don't have a choice, she said quietly. You wouldn't understand. Try me, Darius replied. His voice softened, though there was a sharpness to it that betrayed his confusion. Lyra paused for a long moment before speaking again, her gaze unwavering. If I go back, they'll think I'm weak. I'll be branded a traitor. The words hung in the air, and Darius felt something heavy settle in his chest. He had no idea what it was like to live in a world where loyalty meant everything, where failure could be punished by death. You won't be alone, he said after a moment, though even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure what they meant. Was he offering to protect her? He hadn't exactly thought this through, but what choice did he have? If he left her here alone, she would never survive. And if he returned to camp with her, his superiors would demand answers. I'm not leaving you here, he said more firmly. Lyra's eyes softened, the suspicion and distrust starting to fade, but she didn't speak. Darius stood up abruptly, his mind made up, though uncertain of where his decision would lead him. We'll figure it out, together. As the morning light grew brighter, the weight of their situation settled around them, heavier than either of them anticipated. They were two people from opposite sides of a war, forced into an alliance neither had chosen, and neither fully understood. But for now, there was no going back. They would have to face the consequences of this strange bond, whatever it was, together. The day passed quietly, the air thick with the tension that hung between them. Darius moved with purpose, gathering supplies from the sparse remnants of his previous camp, while Lyra remained behind, resting against the cave wall, watching him with an intensity he couldn't ignore. Every time their eyes met, a flicker of something unspoken passed between them. It was as though they were both waiting for the other to make the next move, but neither of them knew exactly what that move should be. Darius didn't quite know how to feel about the situation. He had always been a soldier, driven by duty and instinct. His emotions were a distant thing, something he could bury with the next battle. But this was different. The more time he spent with Lyra, the more he found himself drawn to her. There was a quiet strength in her, a resilience he hadn't expected from someone who had been cast into an enemy role since birth. It made him question everything he had believed. Lyra had kept mostly to herself, her gaze often distant, lost in her thoughts. He wasn't sure what to say to her, and when he did speak, she only offered short answers. But there was a wariness in her eyes, a guardedness that made it clear she wasn't yet sure whether to trust him. He didn't blame her. He was still struggling to trust himself. Later in the afternoon, after Darius had gathered enough food and supplies to last them a few more days, he stood near the cave entrance, scanning the horizon. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting long shadows over the land, and the air had a crispness to it, the kind that signaled the onset of evening. Lyra's voice broke the silence. Where will we go? She asked, her tone hesitant but curious. Darius turned to her, his face unreadable. He hadn't thought that far ahead. His mind had been too focused on keeping them alive, on making sure she didn't get any worse. He had promised not to leave her, but he had no clear plan on what to do next. They couldn't stay here, her people would eventually find them, and they couldn't go back to the human camp, not without drawing suspicion and risking his life. He sighed, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. I don't know yet, but we can't stay here. We need to move before nightfall. Lyra seemed to hesitate, as though the idea of leaving the relative safety of the cave was something she didn't want to face. She shifted slightly, adjusting her position. Do you think they'll find us? They will, Darius replied bluntly. Your people won't give up that easily. They'll track you. Lyra didn't look at him as she spoke again. And what will you do then? I'll protect you, Darius answered without thinking. He'd said it before, but this time it felt different. The words felt more like a promise than a simple response. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and for the first time, he saw something more than wariness in her gaze. There was a flicker of something, gratitude, perhaps, or something softer, but it was quickly masked by her usual guarded expression. She looked away again, her voice barely a whisper. I don't deserve your protection. Darius frowned, confused by the statement. Why do you think that? Lyra's head lowered, and she pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. I've killed before, she said, her voice quiet but heavy with something darker. I've taken lives, just like you. The admission hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of her words. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Darius could feel the tension building again, the knowledge that they had both been soldiers, both been trained to kill without hesitation. He didn't know what to say to ease the moment. He had been in battles, had slaughtered countless enemies, but hearing her say it, hearing her voice break slightly as she confessed, shifted something inside him. I'm not going to judge you for what you've done, he said slowly, carefully. You did what you had to. We all do. Lyra didn't look up, but the muscles in her body seemed to relax just a fraction, as though his words had somehow reached her. The quiet stretched on between them until Darius finally broke the silence. We need to move. I'll figure something out. She nodded quietly, but she didn't get up immediately. Instead, she continued to sit there, her arms wrapped around her knees, her body curled inward as though she was bracing herself for something. It made Darius uneasy. He couldn't quite place it, but the way she had pulled into herself, the way her shoulders had stiffened, was a clear sign that there was something else she wasn't saying. We should leave before it gets dark, he repeated, but his voice was softer now, more understanding. Lyra stood slowly, but there was a hesitation in her movements. Her gaze flicked to him, and then to the horizon, where the fading light of day seemed to stretch endlessly. It was as though she were torn between two worlds, two destinies, one in which she remained an enemy, and one where she didn't have to be. We'll leave soon, she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. But we need to know where we're going. Darius let out a breath, nodding. I know. They didn't speak much more after that, the weight of their unspoken agreement hanging between them. Darius spent the next few hours gathering everything he could, preparing for the journey ahead. He knew they couldn't afford to linger. Her tribe would be out looking for her, and while they had a small advantage in terms of the head start, that wouldn't last long. He didn't know what he was hoping for. He couldn't even bring himself to picture a safe place for them. There was no such thing. But somehow, despite the danger, despite the looming uncertainty, the thought of moving forward with her didn't seem like the worst thing. As dusk began to settle over the cave, Darius made sure their things were packed. He gave Lyra one last look before they left, her eyes fixed on the ground, her posture still tense. She was waiting for something, perhaps his next move, perhaps something deeper, but he couldn't give her the answers she was looking for. Ready? He asked quietly, his voice low. Viranodit. I'm ready. With that, they left the cave together, the cool night air brushing against their faces as they ventured into the unknown. Neither of them knew what awaited them, but both of them knew one thing for certain. They couldn't go back. The war was still there, still raging, but for now they had each other. And that, for better or worse, would have to be enough. The journey was quiet at first. Darius led the way, his instincts as a soldier taking over as he kept his senses sharp, scanning the dense woods around them. The cool night air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, but it wasn't the peaceful stillness that held his attention. It was the uneasy sense that they were being watched. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig, set him on edge. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, though he knew the path ahead was far more dangerous than any immediate threat in the trees. His mind was occupied by the weight of his decision. He couldn't shake the feeling that bringing Lyra along was a mistake, yet his actions said otherwise. Lyra walked silently beside him, her eyes occasionally flicking upward to meet his before quickly looking away. Her strides were slow but deliberate, and though she was weaker than him, she held herself with a quiet dignity that made him wonder how much strength she had left inside. They had walked for hours without speaking much, just the occasional murmur from Lyra as they passed through narrow paths, her golden eyes always scanning their surroundings. She was alert, just as he was, though he wasn't sure if it was out of caution for him or instinctual wariness. She was a warrior, after all, trained to survive. They stopped when the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, casting pale light over the landscape. Darius found a sheltered spot under a thick canopy of trees, and they settled in for a brief rest. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't exactly warm either. He couldn't read her, and in turn, she didn't seem to know how to approach him. "You should rest," Darius said after a while, watching her sit on a large rock, staring at the ground. "We'll move again at sunset." Lyra glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I'm fine." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the faint tremor beneath it, the weariness in her tone. She had been through a lot in the last few days. Injuries, exhaustion, and the emotional weight of everything that had happened. He wasn't sure if she could even comprehend the danger they were both in, but he knew one thing for sure. She wasn't used to being in a position where someone else had to care for her. Darius sat down opposite her, the weight of his armor creaking as he lowered himself to the ground. His eyes studied her face for a moment, the faint traces of blood on her skin from the battle, the soft curve of her lips that had rarely smiled. She was different from the soldiers he had fought in the past. There was something fragile about her, despite her strength. It made him feel conflicted. "You're not going to stop me from protecting you, are you?" Darius asked after a beat, his voice quieter than usual. Lyra turned to him, her golden eyes narrowing just slightly. "I didn't ask for your protection. I know," he said, his voice steady, though something inside him ached at the truth of her words. "But I'm still giving it." She looked away, her gaze focused on the horizon. "I can take care of myself." "You're hurt?" Darius pointed out, his eyes softening despite himself. "And you're not in a position to do that right now." Her lips tightened, and for a moment, he thought she would snap at him, but she didn't. Instead, she looked down at her hands, fingers tracing the dirt on the ground as though trying to distract herself. "I'm not weak," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than he expected. "I've fought, I've survived. But sometimes, it's not enough." Darius leaned forward slightly, his gaze more intense now. "Surviving isn't the same as living." The words hung in the air, and Lyra didn't respond. He couldn't tell if she agreed with him, or if she had her own view on the matter. But the tension between them shifted, slightly but still noticeably. Something was changing in the way they regarded each other. Neither of them had chosen this situation, yet it was happening. They were caught in something neither of them could escape. He could feel the weight of her presence beside him, like an unseen force pulling at the edges of his awareness. It was as though every quiet gesture she made, every subtle movement, left an imprint on his mind. Darius leaned back against a tree, his eyes closing for a moment as he tried to shake the thoughts that clung to him. He had known fear, seen death, and faced enemies without hesitation. But this was different. It wasn't just the war anymore. There was something in Lyra's quiet gaze, in her unspoken words, that unsettled him. "Do you ever wonder what comes after?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. She turned her head to him, clearly caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" Darius met her eyes, his expression thoughtful. "After the fighting, after the bloodshed, what's left? Is there more than just this? Just survival?" Lyra's gaze lingered on him for a long moment. "I don't know. I've never had time to think about it. We were always at war." Darius nodded slowly. He understood that. The war had been their lives, their reason for existence. But now, they were both standing at the edge of something else, something unknown, and neither of them knew how to navigate it. "I'm going to find a way to end this," he said, his voice determined, though he wasn't sure exactly how he would do it. "This war, the fighting, I won't stop until it's over." Lyra didn't respond at first, but then she shifted closer to him, her body language subtle but clear. "And what if it never ends?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying an edge. "What if we keep fighting forever?" What happens then? He didn't have an answer to that, at least not one he could give her. The reality of war was that it didn't always have a neat resolution. Sometimes it just kept going. But he had to believe that there was more to life than the endless cycle of bloodshed. He had to. "We'll make it end," he said finally, his gaze firm, though his heart wasn't as certain as his words. Lyra fell silent again, her eyes flickering away from his as if lost in thought. There was something in her posture, in the way she held herself, that made Darius wonder what was going on in her mind. She was different from the soldiers he had known, different from the enemy he had always been trained to fight. But he couldn't quite figure out what that difference was. The sun had risen higher in the sky, the light growing warmer, but the tension between them remained. They had formed an uneasy truce, one neither of them quite understood. Darius couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, but what it was, he couldn't tell. "Let's rest for a few more hours," he said, his voice softer now. "Then we'll move on." Lyra didn't respond, but there was a flicker in her eyes that made him think she had heard him. As they sat in the quiet of the woods, surrounded by the stillness of the morning, both of them knew that the path ahead would be even more uncertain than the one they had already traveled. And whatever happened next, they would face it together, whether they were ready or not. The following days passed in a blur of travel, and with each step, Darius felt the weight of the uncertainty grow heavier. They had made it far from the cave, further than he had expected, but it didn't feel like an escape. Not yet. The land around them was unfamiliar, and there was no telling when they would encounter another threat. Lyra remained a quiet companion, her golden eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, alert for danger. Though the tension between them was still palpable, there were moments, fleeting ones, when Darius could feel a different kind of pull. Her presence was comfortable in a way he couldn't entirely explain. Despite the weight of their situation, there was something calming about the way she moved, the softness of her voice when she spoke, even the way her breath came in shallow gasps when the exhaustion from their travel began to weigh on her. At night, they huddled close to a fire, the warmth a temporary relief from the cold that crept in as soon as the sun sank below the horizon. Lyra would stare into the flames, her face illuminated by the flickering light, her expression distant. Darius, meanwhile, found himself increasingly drawn to her quiet strength. He could see the bruises still fresh on her arms, the way she winced every time she moved too quickly, yet she didn't complain. She just kept going, pushing herself forward as if she had no choice but to survive. The silence between them had changed over the course of the journey, becoming less tense, though still unspoken. There was an undeniable bond forming between them, one that neither of them had expected, let alone wanted. Darius knew that he couldn't afford to become too emotionally entangled with her. She was a demi-human, an enemy, but the longer they traveled together, the harder it became to remember that. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Darius found himself staring at Lyra, watching the play of light across her features. Her face was a mix of exhaustion and quiet resolve, her expression still unreadable but softer than it had been when they first met. "You don't have to keep pretending you're fine," Darius said, his voice low. "I can tell you're not." Lyra turned her gaze toward him, eyes widening just slightly before quickly looking away. There was a moment's hesitation before she spoke. "I'm not pretending," she replied, her voice quieter than usual. "I'm just not used to needing help." Darius shifted, feeling an ache in his chest that he couldn't explain. "You don't have to do this alone." She met his eyes again, this time holding his gaze longer. "I've always had to." The words hung between them, heavy with an unspoken history that neither of them knew how to navigate. For a moment, neither spoke. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the space, a gentle reminder of the world that kept moving around them while they were caught in their own. "You don't have to be strong all the time," Darius said after a beat. "Not with me." Lyra let out a soft breath, her eyes softening for a fraction of a second before her guard returned. "I've never known anything else," she murmured. Darius wanted to say something more, something to break through the walls she had built, but he didn't know how. Instead, he simply sat there, his gaze still fixed on her, watching as she looked away once more, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her tunic. There was so much unsaid between them, so much both of them were afraid to acknowledge. The next day, the tension in the air seemed even thicker than before. They had passed through dense forests and open fields, always on the move, always wary. The weight of their situation was beginning to feel unbearable, and Darius knew that something had to give. But every time he considered making a move, reaching out, acknowledging the quiet but undeniable connection between them, he pulled back, fearful of what it might mean. They were nearing the edge of a cliff when it happened. The first sign of danger came in the form of distant shouts, voices carried by the wind, too far to make out but unmistakably human. Darius froze, his instincts kicking in immediately. "Get down!" he hissed, grabbing Lyra by the arm and pulling her toward a cluster of rocks. His pulse quickened as he scanned the horizon. The sounds of pursuit were growing louder, closer. The soft murmurs of the enemy soldiers, voices belonging to those who had been sent after them, could now be heard clearly. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as she crouched behind the rocks with him. Her body was stiff with tension, her hand instinctively gripping the hilt of the small blade she had taken from Darius earlier. He could feel her pulse racing next to him, her body as tense as his own. The soldiers were drawing nearer, and Darius could hear the rustle of their movements, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on dry ground. They were outnumbered again, and this time there was no easy way out. Darius shifted closer to Lyra, his mind racing. They couldn't fight their way through this, they had to hide. He reached out to grab her wrist, his touch lingering for a moment longer than necessary. It was a small, intimate gesture, but in that fleeting moment, he felt the heat of her skin against his, the faint tremor in her hand. Lyra turned to him, her golden eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. Her lips parted, as though she were about to say something, but then she stopped herself, her words dying in her throat. There was no time for explanations, no time for hesitation. Darius took a breath, his voice low but firm. "Stay quiet, stay close." They pressed themselves into the shadows, the sound of their pursuers growing nearer. For a long moment, all Darius could hear was the pounding of his own heart, the rapid breaths coming from both of them. His hand remained on her wrist, a subtle, constant reassurance that he would protect her, no matter what. They stayed like that, huddled together, for what felt like an eternity. Then, at the last possible moment, the soldiers passed by them, unaware of their presence. Darius waited until he was certain they were far enough away before he allowed himself to breathe again. Lyra's grip on his hand loosened slightly, and she leaned in closer, her body still trembling from the close call. Her face was inches from his, and Darius couldn't help but notice the way her eyes softened, how she was no longer the cold, distant warrior she had been when they first met. "I owe you my life," she whispered, her voice shaky but sincere. Darius didn't know how to respond. His throat felt tight, the words stuck inside him. All he could do was nod, feeling the weight of their shared moment settle between them. The bond was growing stronger, undeniable in its intensity, and no matter how hard he tried to resist it, Darius knew that there was no going back now. They waited in the shadows until the coast was clear, but as they moved on, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that something far more dangerous than the soldiers, was looming ahead. The days that followed were a blur of tension and exhaustion. Darius and Lyra moved through the dense forest, never stopping for long, always listening for the faintest sound that could signal danger. The enemy soldiers were relentless, but they had to stay one step ahead. Every night, Darius would scan the horizon, his eyes sharp and focused, his hand always resting near the hilt of his sword. The firelight would cast shadows across their faces, and in those moments, when their eyes met, the silence between them felt heavy, almost suffocating. Lyra was no longer the distant, cold figure she had once been. Her moments of vulnerability, though rare, had left a mark on Darius. She had started opening up, little by little, sharing small details about her past, her life before they met. She spoke of a village she had once known, a place that had been destroyed in the same war that had torn their worlds apart. The sorrow in her voice was subtle, but it was there, woven into the fabric of her words, hidden beneath the layers of her usually guarded demeanor. And Darius, he couldn't help but listen. He found himself wanting to know more, to understand the woman who had been thrust into a war she had never asked for. There was something about her that called to him, something that made him want to protect her, even though he knew he should keep his distance. She was his enemy, or at least she had been. But now she was something else. The night they made camp near an old stone ruin, something shifted. It was a cool evening, the sky dark with the promise of rain. The ruins were a reminder of the ancient world, crumbling stone walls that had withstood the passage of centuries. It was quiet here, a temporary reprieve from the chaos that had followed them. As Darius set up a fire, Lyra wandered to the edge of the clearing, her movements slow, thoughtful. Her silhouette against the darkening sky was a striking contrast. The demi-human, the warrior, and yet so much more than that. Darius couldn't help but watch her. Her figure was illuminated by the flickering firelight, casting long shadows across the ground. She turned, as if sensing his gaze, and for a moment, their eyes locked. A brief flash of something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, or perhaps a question neither knew how to ask. She approached the fire, her footsteps light, almost hesitant. The silence between them stretched on, but it no longer felt as oppressive as it had before. Instead, it was an invitation, one they both had been waiting for. "We need to talk," she said softly, her voice steady but laced with something else. Something that wasn't quite fear, but something close. Darius nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. "What about?" he asked, though he already had a feeling of what she might say. The unspoken tension between them had been building for days now, and even though he had tried to push it away, it had been impossible to ignore. She sat across from him, her posture straight, but the tension in her shoulders was clear. "About us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About what this is." Darius swallowed, his mind racing. What was this? He had tried to keep a distance, tried to remind himself that she was still a demi-human, an enemy, and yet, "I don't know," he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. He shifted, the fire casting strange, dancing shadows across his face. "But I do know that I'm not leaving you behind." Lyra's eyes softened at his words, but she didn't speak right away. Her gaze dropped to her hands, the calluses on her palms stark in the dim light. "You don't have to stay with me," she said quietly, but her words didn't carry the same conviction they once had. "You could still leave. You've done more than enough." Darius frowned, confusion spreading across his face. "Leave you?" he asked, his voice quiet but insistent. "After everything we've been through?" Lyra looked up, meeting his eyes again, but this time there was something different in her gaze, something that softened the hardness he had seen before. "You should," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not the person you think I am. I'm not worth all this." Darius shook his head, his pulse quickening as he leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between them. "You are worth it. You're not just some enemy, Lyra. You're—" He stopped himself before the words could spill out. The confession was on the tip of his tongue, but something inside him held him back. There was a brief silence, but then Lyra spoke again, her voice softer than before. "What if it's all a mistake?" she whispered. "What if we're both just pretending that something else is happening when it's not?" Darius felt his heart tighten in his chest. The question was there, hanging in the air, and he wasn't sure how to answer it. What if she was right? What if this was all just a fleeting connection, one born from shared survival and nothing more? But the thought of leaving her now, after everything they had been through, felt wrong. Felt like a betrayal not just to her, but to himself. He couldn't do that, couldn't walk away and leave her alone in a world that was already so cruel to her. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched her arm, the warmth of her skin seeping through his fingertips. "I don't believe it's a mistake," he said, his voice low and steady. "I don't believe in any of this being a mistake." Her eyes flickered down to his hand on her arm, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them seemed to crackle with a quiet intensity, a moment of understanding that went beyond words. Lyra let out a soft sigh, her breath shaky. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Everything I've known is crumbling, and Darius's chest tightened as he watched her struggle to find the words. She looked so small, so vulnerable in that moment, and for the first time, Darius didn't see a warrior. He saw a woman, a person who had been hurt, a person who was more than just the enemy. Without thinking, he leaned forward, his hands sliding from her arm to her cheek. The touch was gentle, a silent reassurance, and as his thumb brushed across her skin, he felt the subtle shiver that ran through her. She didn't pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. "Lyra," Darius whispered, his voice raw, "I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, they sat there, the world around them forgotten. The fire crackled softly in the background, but it was a distant sound now, drowned out by the pounding of Darius's heart. And in that silence, that fragile moment of connection, it was clear. They were no longer just two people caught in a war. They were something more, something that neither of them could ignore. And yet, despite the bond that was growing stronger with each passing day, the threat of the soldiers, of the war loomed large, casting a shadow over everything they had started to feel for each other. Darius knew that they couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they would have to face what was coming, whatever that might be. But for now, in the quiet of the night, with the warmth of her body close to his and the weight of their shared silence between them, Darius allowed himself to believe in something better, something worth fighting for. And whatever came next, they would face it together. Darius woke to the sound of distant shouting, the harsh voices carrying through the trees. His hand shot to his sword instinctively, heart pounding as he bolted upright. The camp was still, save for the occasional crackle of the dying fire. His eyes flicked to Lyra, still asleep beneath the blanket he'd given her, her breathing slow and steady. But even in the calm of the moment, he could sense it, the shift in the air, the palpable tension that had been building for days. Lyra stirred, her ears twitching at the sound of raised voices. Her eyes opened slowly, and for a second, she seemed disoriented. When her gaze met his, she immediately sat up, her body tense, her claws scraping the earth as she adjusted to the world around her. "What's happening?" she asked in a low voice, her tone filled with urgency. "They're getting closer," Darius said, his voice tight. "We need to move." Lyra nodded, pushing herself to her feet. Her eyes darted toward the dense woods beyond the clearing. The enemy was closing in. They had no time to waste. Darius grabbed his pack, securing it tightly as he scanned the surroundings. The moon was nearly gone, replaced by the dim light of early dawn, and the shadows in the forest were becoming harder to decipher. But Darius's instincts were sharp. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He could hear the crunch of leaves, the soft snap of twigs underfoot. They were being hunted. Lyra moved with a fluid grace beside him, her movements swift, her eyes flickering to the treeline. Darius had never seen anyone move quite like her. So poised, so sure-footed, as if the woods were her domain. Her strength was something he had come to rely on, and now, more than ever, he understood how deeply her past had shaped her. They crept through the trees, keeping to the shadows, but the tension didn't fade. Every rustle of leaves, every crack in the earth beneath their feet seemed like a loud warning. Darius could feel his pulse racing in his ears, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his sword. The threat of discovery loomed heavily over them, but he kept his focus sharp, his eyes flicking from shadow to shadow, his every sense alert. Eventually, they reached a small clearing, and Darius halted. He looked around carefully, his eyes scanning the landscape. The sounds of pursuit had become clearer, more distinct, and he could feel the weight of the enemy's presence creeping ever closer. They were outnumbered and on the edge of exhaustion. He knew they couldn't keep this up forever. "We need to find shelter," Darius said, his voice tight. He looked at Lyra, her expression unreadable but her body still brimming with tension. "We can't keep running." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes dark with concern, but she didn't argue. She nodded silently, and the two of them moved quickly toward a nearby cliffside that would offer some cover. The rocks jutted out in sharp angles, creating a natural barrier that they could use to their advantage. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As they climbed, Darius could feel the weight of his earlier thoughts creeping back. Their growing connection, the way her presence seemed to fill the empty spaces in his heart, was both a blessing and a curse. In these moments, with danger lurking at every corner, he couldn't afford to dwell on it. He needed to be focused. But even so, there were moments when he couldn't help himself, when his gaze would linger on her, watching the way her body moved, the quiet strength that radiated from her. Lyra seemed to notice his stare once or twice, her eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding, though she never commented. The silence between them had grown comfortable, even in the midst of chaos. And yet, there was an underlying tension that neither of them dared to acknowledge. A tension that neither of them could escape, no matter how many miles they put between them and the enemies on their trail. As they reached the top of the cliff, they crouched down behind a thick cluster of rocks. They were hidden, for the moment, but Darius knew it wouldn't be long before the enemy would pass by. "Do you think we'll make it?" Lyra asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her eyes searched his, as if trying to gauge his resolve. "We have to," Darius replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "We'll make it. You're not alone in this anymore." Lyra looked away, her gaze lost in the distance. For a moment, she was silent, her mind seemingly far away. Darius couldn't blame her. He knew what it felt like to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, to feel as if everything you had ever known was slipping through your fingers. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence, sharp and quick. Darius's muscles tensed, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword once more. He could hear them now, the enemy soldiers moving through the trees below. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't spot them. He glanced at Lyra, her eyes wide with fear, but she said nothing. She was just as determined as he was. The footsteps grew closer, and Darius's heart raced. It felt as though the world had slowed down, each heartbeat stretching into eternity. He could feel the heat of the enemy's presence as if they were right on top of him, but he stayed still, his body pressed against the rocks. The slightest movement would betray them. Lyra's breathing had slowed, but Darius could feel the tension rolling off her in waves. He wanted to reach out to comfort her, but the danger was too great. They couldn't afford to make a sound, not now. The footsteps finally passed, and a wave of relief washed over him. But it was short-lived. He could hear them moving further into the forest, their voices still clear and sharp. But the moment they were out of earshot, he exhaled sharply. "Not much longer," Darius murmured, his voice low. "Vi it." They both knew that their window of safety wouldn't last. They couldn't stay hidden forever, and the realization struck Darius like a cold wave. Soon, they would have to make a choice, to face the enemy head-on or continue running. Neither option was without consequence. As the night deepened, Darius's mind raced. Their bond was undeniable, but so was the threat surrounding them. It wouldn't be long before they were forced to confront everything they had avoided. Every moment of vulnerability they had shared, every whispered word in the night, was now tied to something larger, something more dangerous. He knew that whatever they decided next, it would change everything. And it had to be soon. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Darius knew they had no time left. The enemy was closing in, their footsteps now unmistakable, their voices louder and more distinct. They had been hiding in the cliffside for hours, waiting, but it was clear that the moment for stealth had passed. The danger was too great, and the risk of staying hidden any longer was too high. Lyra's eyes met his, filled with an unspoken understanding. She had been quiet, her usual calm demeanor replaced by an urgency he hadn't seen before. They both knew that the decision they were about to make would either bring them safety or lead to their doom. "We have to move," Darius said, his voice a low murmur. He stood up from his crouch, scanning the dense forest below for any sign of movement. We can't outrun them, but maybe we can make them think we're elsewhere. Lyra nodded, her claws scraping against the rock as she stood. Her eyes were wide but filled with determination. She had trusted him this far, and now it was time for them both to face the consequences of that trust. They had built something between them, an unspoken bond that was as fragile as it was strong. She wasn't sure when it had happened, but she had come to rely on Darius in ways she hadn't allowed herself before. The quiet moments they shared, the way he protected her, the gentle touches that spoke volumes, all of it had begun to mean something more. But now wasn't the time to dwell on that. Together they moved swiftly, slipping through the trees and down the rocky slope. Their movements were silent but urgent, every step calculated. Darius led the way, his instincts sharp as ever, and Lyra followed close behind, her senses just as keen. She could hear the enemy in the distance, but for now, they were out of sight, hidden by the thick underbrush. As they approached a small clearing, Darius paused. He could hear the enemy soldiers just beyond the tree-line, their voices growing louder with each passing second. The moment of reckoning was upon them. He could no longer afford to keep running. "Ready?" he whispered to Lyra, his heart racing. She didn't answer at first, but her eyes, those amber eyes that had captured him since the moment they met, told him everything he needed to know. She was ready. He didn't wait for another word. With a sharp motion, he drew his sword, the sound of metal sliding from its sheath slicing through the air. Lyra mirrored him, her claws outstretched, her gaze focused, a fierce determination etched across her features. They waited in the shadows as the enemy drew closer. The air was thick with tension, the only sounds the pounding of their own hearts and the distant voices of the soldiers. Then, just as the first enemy soldier emerged into the clearing, Darius sprang into action. He moved like a shadow, swift and silent. In one fluid motion, he lunged at the soldier, knocking him to the ground with a precise strike. The enemy's surprised shout was muffled by the force of the attack, but Darius was already moving to the next. His blade cut through the air, a blur of silver in the early morning light. Behind him, Lyra followed suit. Her movements were fluid, graceful, yet deadly. She sliced through the enemy ranks with a terrifying precision, her claws cutting through the air like blades. The soldiers were no match for her speed and agility, but even so, they outnumbered them. It was only a matter of time before reinforcements arrived. "Darius," Lyra called, her voice filled with urgency. "We can't hold them off much longer." He turned to her, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The fight was far from over, but he could see the strain on her face, the weariness creeping into her movements. They needed to make a choice, and fast. With a grunt of frustration, Darius pulled her close, just as another wave of soldiers charged toward them. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get to the ridge. We'll have the high ground." Lyra didn't argue. She simply nodded, her gaze flashing with resolve. Together, they turned and ran, their feet pounding against the earth as they moved toward the ridge, their path lit by the rising sun. As they neared the ridge, Darius's thoughts raced. They couldn't outrun the soldiers for much longer, and the high ground would give them a moment's advantage, but it wouldn't be enough to win this fight. Not if they didn't make their stand now. "We'll hold them here," Darius said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in his mind. "You take the left flank, I'll cover the right." Lyra nodded again, her jaw set in a tight line. The plan was simple, but it relied on both of them moving as one, trusting the other completely. The battle that followed was chaotic. The soldiers charged in waves, relentless in their pursuit. Darius fought with everything he had, his sword flashing through the air as he cut down the attackers. Lyra, ever graceful, struck with terrifying precision, her claws rending through armor and flesh alike. But for every soldier they took down, two more seemed to take their place. Their chances of survival were growing slimmer by the minute. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the overwhelming odds, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Their bond had deepened in ways that neither of them had fully understood. Every swing of his sword, every turn of his head to make sure she was safe, felt more urgent than the last. He was fighting not just for survival, but for her. Lyra, too, had changed. She fought with a ferocity that was almost unnatural, driven by the unspoken connection between them. He saw it in the way she moved, in the way her eyes locked onto his every time their gazes met. She was no longer the lone warrior she had once been. She was something more now, something that belonged to him and that he belonged to her. But there was no time for more thoughts, no time for anything but the battle. Then, just as Darius thought they might be overwhelmed, the sound of reinforcements reached their ears. This time, it was the sound of more familiar voices. Soldiers from Darius's camp had arrived. The tide of battle shifted almost instantly as the reinforcements charged into the fray, driving the enemy back. It wasn't over, but for the first time, Darius allowed himself a breath. They had won. For now, Lyra staggered back, breathless and bloodied, but her gaze locked onto his. A quiet understanding passed between them, something unspoken but clear. They had made it through the storm together. Darius walked toward her, his steps heavy but sure. When he reached her, he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The moment they shared spoke volumes. Their hands met, fingers entwining in a silent promise. A promise that no matter what came next, they would face it together. As the sun finally rose, casting a golden light over the battlefield, Darius knew that their journey was far from over. But whatever lay ahead, he was no longer alone, and neither was she.